I
Start.
get telling you some of these things, then the first thing I know, I forget them. I think I remember the story you was telling me. How about the dream I had last night?
What's your dream last night?
Uh, well, I dreamed I saw an airplane coming into an airport, and it was all on fire underneath.
Yeah.
And it landed and broke up and bursted into flames all along it.
Yeah. Well, that don't.
I saw two men, one after the other, come running over to a tank that's set there on the airfield, and the flexible hose, and they were on flame all over, and they sprayed themselves, whatever this was, and put the fire out.
Mhm.
And I saw a third fella come running over. He was on fire from his waist down, and he put the fire out. And I kind of had the impression that he was one of those who first came over and put the fire out, and had gone back to help and caught on fire again.
Yeah. Well, that might be. Maybe we'll see it in the news later on.
Well, sometimes I see those things, and you read about it in the news, and a couple of days afterwards, and maybe it's a prophecy I won't fly back. You never can tell.
You never can tell, Ghost.
When I was up here last year, I had a couple of dreams about the planes wrecking, and one of them I was on it. Nobody was hurt, although there was about 19 people on it. They all seemed to be all right.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
of
tell
course,
me.
then they went out on strike, and I couldn't fly back.
Yeah. Well, tell me about the dream about the 19 people on the plane.
Well, the only thing I pretty near forgot about that. They all got off the plane all right, and one of them was more interested in complaining about the delay than anything else, rather than whether they had been safely landed. But everyone seemed to get out all right.
Mhm.
But I've forgotten all about most of that over the past year.
Yeah. Forgot the details. I mean.
Yeah. And then I had a dream about another plane that was wrecked, but I don't remember anything about that now. But
How about
anyway, they did go out on a strike, and I had to find other means to get back home.
Yeah. How about the story you told me about the guy up to work there, out in the kitchen?
Which one was that?
You know about the guy in Syracuse or Albany or Schenectady or something in the church.
I
Start.
get telling you some of these things, then the first thing I know, I forget them. I think I remember the story you was telling me
No,
about the one that McLean was telling me about.
Yeah, that's the one.
Uh, McLean asked me if I had time to listen to a story, and
Yeah, this is the one.
he told me that he had a very dear friend, and of course what he meant was a close friend.
Yeah.
And
Right.
he was selling oil for Ray Oil Company, and he had the territory east to Utica and to the west to Batavia. And being a good church member, or whatever city he happened to be in, on a Sunday, why, he'd go to church.
Yeah.
And when he was in Utica this particular Sunday, why, he was going to St. Mary's Church there. And on his way to church, he saw a seedy-looking individual walking toward him. And when he spotted him, he thought, well, this fellow's going to make a touch. And the closer he got to him, why, the more the impression grew on him that the fellow was going to stop him. And when they met, the fellow says, are you on your way to church? And I told him yes. And he says, well, I had no place to stay last night, but I knew if I could get into the church without anybody seeing me, I'd have a warm place to sleep. So I got into the church, and during the night, I heard sounds up on the altar, and he said, I raised up and looked, and the altar was being lighted up with a rose-colored light. He said the best way to describe it is moonlight. Then I could hear sounds of bell tinkling, and finally a figure in black come out, walked back and forth on the altar, and finally he disappeared, and the sounds died away and the lights faded away. Well, the young fellow says, "Will you go over to the parish and tell the priest just what you told me?" And he said, "Well, yes, I will." So they went over he told his story to the priest. And the priest said, "Will you stay in the church with me tonight?" And the fellow says, "Why, yes, I'll be glad to." The young fellow from Rochester, he says, "I'd like to stay too." And the priest says, "That would be all right. Then there'll be three of us." So then they stayed in the church on Sunday night, and just around about midnight, the altar began to light up, and the priest, he got up and walked up to the altar rail. Then they began to hear bells tinkling, and a form walked out, and the form said, "Who will assist me with this Mass?" And the priest said, "In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Ghost, who are you?" Well, the young fellow said that they could hear him answered, but couldn't hear what he said. And presently he says, "Who will assist me with this Mass?" And the priest says, "I will assist you." So the priest, he took the part of the altar boy and went through the Mass with this apparition that had appeared. When the Mass was over, he came back to where the two men were seated and told them that that was the soul of a priest who at one time refused to say a Mass, and his soul couldn't find rest and peace until he had returned and said this Mass. The young fellow telling my friend McLean there, he said, "Well, I've never led a very sinful life, but he says, it's made me think." He said, "I haven't been able to sleep since Sunday night."
Mm-hmm.
And this was Friday night, he was telling McLean.
He's probably got a guilty conscience there, Father.
Well, I wouldn't say it had a guilty conscience.
Kind of shook him up a little, huh?
I think it was quite a revelation to him to really learn that people do live after this change called death.
Yeah, well, wait a minute, I'll be
And
playing here. Whoop.
so that's the way it was.
That doesn't accomplish nothing, yeah.
Another time before that, McLean, knowing I was interested in
Spiritualism?
spiritualism, as you would call it, or the thought that man lived forever, that there was no such thing as death, that only the body dies, Mac came to me one morning and he says, "I'd like to tell you a story." And I says, "Okay." He says, "I was sitting in my study last night." He says, "I was sitting there thinking, and I felt a hand placed on my shoulder." And he said, "And I turned around and looked." He said, "Could that be possible?" I says, "It certainly could." I said, "It was your father." I said, "Where you were seated," I said, "there was a picture of him right opposite you on the wall, and you were sitting there looking at your father's picture, and you were thinking of him. And he appeared right behind you, and he laid his hand on your shoulder because he was well pleased with you." And I said, "When you turned, you expected to see him because you could feel his hand so plainly." Now I said, "As you tell me this story," I said, "your father is right here. I can feel his presence." And I says, "I'm impressed to tell you that you really did know that he was there." But I says, in your own mind, there was a question whether you imagined it. I said, an awful lot of people imagine they see things or hear things when actually they do see and hear them. So that's about all the experience I had with McLean.
Yeah, well, that's the one I was thinking about. Well, how did you ever get interested in the spiritualism to start with, Papa Yost?
Just out of curiosity.
Yeah, curiosity killed the cat.
I came here to Rochester at the end of 1918.
Yeah.
Of course, I was a member of the Baptist Church then, and I went over to a watch night service of the First Baptist Church downtown on Church Street.
Yeah.
And there I met a man whom I became friendly with.
Yeah.
And he says to me, "Let's go up to the Spiritus Church tomorrow night." So I went up to the Spiritus Church with him.
Yeah,
I was quite
where was that?
on South Plymouth,
Yeah.
First Plymouth Spiritualist Church. But I
Uh-huh.
was quite surprised, the people that were flocking there at that church,
Yeah.
because at the end of World War One, everyone was interested in the whereabouts of their loved ones, whether or not they had lived through the war,
Uh-huh.
and so they filled the church. Well, they would seat 2,000 people in that church, and they had locked the doors because more people came than they could handle.
Yeah.
So I says, I thought to myself, well, this looks pretty good. I really was interested in it
Uh-huh.
because over the years that had passed, I used to have dreams and visions, and a lot of these things came to pass just as I had seen them.
Uh-huh.
Especially two dreams I had that I thought that actually my life was saved because I was doing things that would cause a person to lose their life.
Yeah, like what?
And these dreams, they showed me that what I was doing was wrong.